written under all kinds of circumstances, during religious and political persecution, in war and peace. And the people who write have been princes and scholars, priests, and even a few madmen. Who are these dreamers of dreams, these music makers? Today we'll meet Chicago poet Paul Carroll and find out a little more about poetry. Welcome, Paul. You were born on the south side of Chicago and raised in an Irish Catholic family. What was your childhood like?
Well, it was in many ways terrific. I had a very good father who was a real guy. He actually was a banker and a real estate man, very successful at both of those enterprises. But he had a farm out in Palos, about 30 miles due west of Chicago. And that was the Garden of Eden to me.
How did those early experiences affect your writing?
Oh, tremendously, because everything was like a miracle. Without, I don't mean to make that into a too much of a metaphor, but everything was real. We had a hired hand named Smitty, and he would let me ride with him on the tractor. I'll read you a poem about this sometime. We'd bounce over those damn fields. I'd sit between Smitty's legs. It was real. And we had the pony named Brownie. I'd ride that pony up and down those hills, trying to evade the bones of the Potawatomi.
You talk a little bit about some of those experiences in Chicago Tales,
Yes.
about your Irish father and your Austrian mother.
He was a man, and he loved the farm. He loved real things. And that farm was a real place to me. The other parts of it were, they were fun. They were as difficult as any adolescent, difficult. I went to a very good high school, Mount Carmel, on the south side. It was a jock school, and I played a lot of ball there and had fun. I didn't learn a damn thing, except Latin for 4 years, which has helped me not at all in this life, But the point is that it was a good childhood, and my old psychoanalyst once said to me, "You had a good life." And I said, "I did?" He said, "Yes, you did." And he was right.
Well, your poetry reflects a love of philosophy, literature, and art. Did your love of books begin early back then, or more in high school and college?
Not at all. I said I came from that particular kind of background. It was money, and it was sports. And I had no idea about poetry. I got to college, because I wasn't a very good student in high school. I went to a small college after World War II, Illinois Wesleyan, down in Bloomington. And I was just bumping around there, playing ball and trying to get laid and so on. And then suddenly, one day, I'll never forget it, I was in the library, and I had to do research for a history book or some essay or something. I'd heard from some guys at a party that there was this dirty Irish book called Ulysses. So I went to the librarian. You must remember, this is 1947 or something, a long time ago. And I said, "Could I have a copy of Ulysses?" And she said, this was a very small town Methodist world. And she said, "You can't, that book is restricted." And I said, "Well, how can I read it?" And she said, "You must have a letter from your professor." I said, "Oh, I do have one in my bag." So I went back and wrote a letter saying, "This student has a right to read Ulysses, signed Professor so." I gave it to her, and she said, "Well, all right." As if I had done something evil, So she brought back the book. I sat down. I couldn't understand a goddamn word of it. It was in English. It was from an Irish writer. I came from that background, but I couldn't understand it. And so I brought it back, but I suddenly found out about books. I don't know how or why. Those books didn't help that much. But suddenly I thought, God, they're pretty good. So I began reading books, and I became an absolute nut, a hermit, really. I just kept reading and reading and reading. I loved it. I never went to school. I was kicked out, finally, because I had bad class attendance and all that. But I kept reading and reading and reading, like a lunatic. My girl kept knocking on the door. I had a little hot plate. All I wanted to do was read books. But I had no idea about poetry. I got to the University of Chicago eventually, and I was reading still, like a nut, really. I loved it. I just loved it. It was like finding a real person you want to be with. And I started to write poetry. One student, actually. I had a friend named Miriam, and she was a buddy, and it wasn't romantic, but just a pal. And we used to talk a lot, and then she told me one night that she was in love. And she wasn't that pretty, incidentally, but her face was radiant when she told me about it. She loved another student, a friend of ours, and she was so eloquent. I went home and I wrote a pretty bad poem, actually. And I gave it to her the next day, a sonnet. It wasn't very good. And she said, "It's good, it's bad Hopkins, but it's good." But that's how I started, and I haven't stopped.
In the 50s, you were driving a checker cab when you heard about the death of poet Pablo Neruda.
In the 60s it was.
You wrote this about Neruda. You said, "In spats and battered bowler, he has begun the slow, soft, incredibly elegant dance." You called him Mr. Bojangles, and you said his poems were parachutes.
That's right.
When did you first become acquainted with his poetry?
With Neruda? Mm-hmm. Oh, when I had that magazine, Big Table, there was a young poet from Indiana University named Clayton Eshelman. And Clayton sent some translations of Neruda. I'd never heard of him. I couldn't read Spanish. But Clayton sent 2 of these poems. I thought they're terrific. And I published them in the magazine. And then I did my best to find out about Neruda. He got to be translated a lot later. He was like a father. I loved him very much because Neruda, he came from a rainforest in the south of Chile. His father was a railroad construction worker. He's one of the great poets of the 20th century. He could write a poem about anything. A watermelon, an onion, the history of Central America, anything.